Okay, thanks Ben and Pat and Meixi for sharing. So now we'll move on to the Q&A segment. If you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A tab as well as upvote questions by pressing the thumbs up button. The speakers can choose to answer each question live or type out their answer, and the speakers can feel free to answer each question right now, and I'll read out the top few upvoted questions first, and subsequently people in the audience can feel free to ask any more questions as well. So the first question is for Benjamin. So most recent deforestation actually occurred in Papua and only a few forests remain in Riau. Can you expand on the link between haze and deforestation? Ben, you're muted.
Thanks. I think it was Aloysius who asked that. Yeah. So thanks so much for that question. It's not an easy question to answer, definitely. I mean, there are a lot of pristine forests that are still occurring on Papua at the moment, and there are a lot of efforts by NGOs around the world to actually protect these forests, right? For our purpose, I mean, when we look at transboundary haze, we are really looking at transboundary haze that comes from Indonesia to Singapore. And if you look at our map and according to weather patterns, we are looking at haze essentially that comes either from the southern part of Sumatra or perhaps even across the straits from Kalimantan, right? Depending on the wind directions and all that. So I think that is really the link between haze and deforestation in Singapore, haze, transboundary haze in Singapore, and deforestation in Indonesia. But perhaps you're right to say that in Sumatra, perhaps not many I mean, there are still rainforests in these areas, but not many of them are left. In that sense, a lot of areas have actually been deforested for various land users over the years. Yeah. I wasn't sure if there was something specific that you wanted me to actually talk about in terms of deforestation.
Maybe I can jump in as well. I think the way to look at it is, I think deforestation rates have a clear sort of it's an indicator of potential fire risks. But I think you also have to look at the difference between the culture in Papua and the difference with the culture in Sumatra and Java, even for that matter. In Papua, the indigenous peoples there are effectively, they're hunter-gatherers, so they don't have a tradition of shifting agriculture. So I think that's one thing. It's also still, compared to what we have in Sumatra, also vastly much more fewer in terms of the people who are there. And so when you have fewer people, the risk of actually burning is also lower. And I think you can therefore see the difference that, even in sort of the figure 2 map that I showed earlier about sort of the hotspots, Papua is probably the only region that isn't sort of covered in sort of red on the WRI monitoring for hotspots. And this is part of the reason. But I think the key thing here is also the areas that are most at risk of fire are degraded areas. So these are areas that are already deforested, but have for over years, especially if it's peat degraded and then becomes sort of like a tinder field. So I think it's important also to understand the differentiation there. So what's happening in Papua is there is deforestation going on, but again, it tends to be large-scale companies doing that deforestation. So they are not using fire. And that is why largely you see, while deforestation rates tend to be higher, they're higher in Papua now because it hasn't been developed, but you don't see that necessarily relating to a higher occurrence of fire. So that is also where a lot of this kind of context is quite important. Pinpointing, of course, that in Sumatra and Java, the tradition of agriculture or small-scale farming is much more prevalent compared to indigenous Papuans.
Okay, then we'll, thanks Pat for answering, and Ben also. So we'll move on to the next question. So this question's for Meixi. So the role of BRG is not clear for us in Singapore. What exactly has BRG done to restore peatlands, and do they have actual quantifiable data to support their claims?
So BRG, as I mentioned earlier, BRG's role is really to restore degraded peatland. However, one difficulty, or one challenge, I guess, that they have had is that a lot of the land that they target to restore is actually not public land. And so it's really up to the companies working with BRG to do this. And in terms of the public land, I think the data shows that they have restored, I think it's something like 60 or 60+% of it as of last year, but that's just the public land. And on the private land, as I mentioned earlier, that number is slightly lower. So that is something that definitely needs to be looked at. And also, as I mentioned, the BRG's mandate is unclear beyond 2020. So ideally, we would hope that the Indonesian government not only extends their mandate, but also expands it so that they can more effectively work in both public and private land. Does that answer the question?
Can the person who asked the question, is it possible if you responded? Oh, then in that case, we'll move on. We'll move on first. So the next question is for Pep, I think. As a larger scale company, what are some steps or tips that Wilmar could offer to small to medium scale companies in managing fire risks? Are there any existing knowledge transfer, technology transfer, or best practicing sharing initiatives? If so, have they been effective?
And I think I did answer the question. You know, it's fine, but it's good to sort of talk about it. I think that the most basic thing to do for any company would be basically to start engaging beyond your boundaries, right? So as we said, I think the risk that you have of fire is not something that you need to just control internally, but you have to control it within what's in your immediate sort of zone. And that will involve some effort getting to know the community, talking to the communities, trying to engage with them on knowledge transfer. So talking about better techniques, how you can do things cheaper instead of using fire, and really creating, I think, that rapport, building the trust, I think, in the communities. So that's the most immediate thing that any company can do to help reduce that risk. You know, if a company has the ability to do the kind of monitoring that we do, for example, you know, to look at satellite monitoring, if you have a GIS department to help identify, take the NASA data, look at even WRI data to sort of see where potential hotspots are and sort of just have a process internally of how you would react to that, that also helps. But I think largely what perhaps is the best way to do it is really to join collaborative efforts like the Free Fire Alliance, where you can share across companies examples and lessons. You know, and you know, it makes it easier. I think it's a community there sharing information and, you know, going through things so that you don't feel so isolated, I think, sometimes in sort of the effort to really reduce the fire risk. So that would be, I think, the takeaway would be its engagement, but also think about it as, you know, how do I find others that are, you know, in the same boat as I am.
All right, thanks, Pep. So next question's from Robin. He asks, an NGO has said that the report, you know, this is for SIA's Haze Outlook 2020 report. An NGO has said that the report understates the contribution of the biggest companies in the pulpwood and palm oil sectors to the ongoing risk of severe fire and haze episodes. The report documents what the biggest pulp and palm oil companies say they are doing to combat fire and haze instead of looking at their actual operations, and therefore reaches the conclusion that the risk lies elsewhere. In the case of Indonesia's pulp sector, the biggest companies have expanded in ways since the 2015 fires that actually compounded pressures on drained peatlands, leaving them increasingly vulnerable to forest fires and haze. What's your response to this?
So I think our response would be that we're not saying that we're not absolving the large companies of of all responsibility. Definitely, the large companies, just by virtue of the fact that they are so large, do have a responsibility to ensure that their own practices are sustainable, and also to help the other companies in their supply chain to do so. And also, we definitely are well aware of certain companies that have been in the news for certain unsustainable practices. What we did want to highlight in the report, I think that question was referring specifically to a section where we highlighted certain sustainability practices of companies in the palm oil and the pulp and paper sector. We did want to highlight that certain companies are doing what they can, especially the large ones, but that the middle-sized companies are a bit more of an unknown and therefore a risk. So that's the main thing that we wanted to highlight. And also, on this specific topic of the middle-sized companies, the large companies also have a part to play, in the sense that a lot of the middle-sized companies, produce product that end up in the supply chains of the larger companies. So the large companies definitely do have a part to play there as well.
Then, okay, thanks, Meixi. Next question for Benjamin. Repeatedly, presenters have talked about the risks that slash and burn farmers and small or medium companies pose to causing haze. Yet none of the measures Singapore are directed to assist or to hold these actors accountable. How do you reconcile this?
Yep, thanks for the question. I think that my co-panelists can probably jump in a little bit as well on this, but I would like to say that it's a difficult situation, right? I mean, we're in a situation whereby we are a sovereign country and Indonesia is a sovereign country. So, in the end of the day, who are we to tell Indonesia that I mean, we can tell them because we are affected by transboundary haze, right? But if we go down to the ground and tell the Indonesian government that you need to we want to prosecute your farmers for causing haze in Singapore, then that definitely from an international relations point of view would not be very feasible in that sense. But of course, the other question is going into the root cause of it, right? Is that why are these fires happening in the first place? Why is there land clearing by fire in the first place? Is it because there is a lack of infrastructure? Is it because there is a lack of resources made available to them? Is it because they do not have financial resources to implement sustainable more sustainable ways of dealing with agriculture? So I think these are the questions that we perhaps need to ask before we can actually jump to the next step on what can actually Singapore do, right? Because I feel that as people living in Singapore, we do have the responsibility as well, right? Because we are part of this region, right? And to a certain extent, we are part of the problem as well, as I've kind of briefly highlighted in my presentation, right? That our demand for consumer products, for example, for a demand for edible products, for example, it is driving land use elsewhere because we don't grow things over in Singapore, right? So if we want these products to be put on our table, or to be put in our supermarkets, then we perhaps need to take that responsibility as well. Yeah.
I think if I can add as well, I think it's addressing, I think, a couple of the questions there. The question about sovereignty, Robin Hicks's question about, is this going to, do we have to be careful about sort of the Indonesian government's kind of feelings, as it were? And I think the answer is yes. I think it is a little bit about diplomacy, and I think there is a tendency, I think, for the Singaporean approach to be very much about, I'm going to tell you what to do because I know better than you. And I think it's important that I think within that conversation, the sovereignty respect it has to be there. I mean, you have to treat Indonesia as a kind of equal government partner to sort of say, look, okay, this is what we can do to sort of assist. And I think perhaps the kind of disconnect between some of the policy statements versus, the realities of what can be done in Indonesia, I think don't necessarily meet. And again, I can articulate this by a sort of example that I personally experienced. So maybe 6 years ago now, when I was working in a big FMCG company in Singapore, we were invited to a kind of business council meeting, and the discussion was talking about peat and what we can do about, let's try and resolve sort of the issue of peat. One of the first comments that was said there by a Singaporean participant in that meeting from, a relatively big government entity, one of the first things that he said was, hey, why don't we think about how we can remove the peat from Indonesia and sell it to like China, where they use peat as fuel? Isn't that a good solution? And I immediately was, my immediate reaction to that was, oh my God, this is going to be a very awkward meeting. But what that highlights is, I think there is a tendency for, and I don't mean this as a kind of nasty comment on Singaporeans, but there is a tendency, I think, in the discussions that are being had around how to find solutions for Indonesia to be talking at kind of a level where there is a disconnect with what's actually going on on the ground. So, I think it is important to look at, like the work that PM Haze is doing is also going to the ground to look at, what can you do? What is it that we can help with sort of the, the grassroots level, at the community level, to assist with that. So I think there is a really large part of, in Singapore, I think we do have to be real a bit, like, let's go down, go see what it's like, and put up your proposals based on that experience, rather than trying to make, kind of policy comments that are based on assumptions. So I think there is a lot more work to be done there. Having said that, I do agree. I think that there is the fact that Singapore is thinking about this does give at least a sense for companies that are based in Singapore, a kind of much more heightened awareness that you have to be much more careful with what you're doing on the ground. But again, data from WRI and from other kind of NGO-backed monitoring platforms have consistently showed that fires are occurring mainly outside of agriculture and tree plantation areas. So there is a large part of the conversation that is not happening there, because a lot of the policy conversation is talking about the larger companies and the plantation areas. And I think until we can really start talking about that 60 to 70% of what's happening in real life in Indonesia on the ground, with the smaller farmers, with the communities, and that level, I don't think we're going to fix this problem very effectively.
Can I just add a quick comment about the role of Singapore? Because quite outside of the whole Transboundary Haze Act and legal tools, there are other ways that Singapore can contribute as well. Consumers already has been mentioned by Ben, the role of consumers, but also Singapore is a hub for trade and for finance. And so in that, that is also a lever to influence the industry to become more sustainable, because all companies need finance, right, to operate. All companies are part of the trading supply chain, I guess. So that in itself is a lever for improving sustainability in the whole industry, and Singapore has a big part to play in that.
Thanks, Meixi and Pat. So currently we'll be answering a few more questions, and those who can't stay on can leave, but we'll aim to end at around maybe 2:45 p.m. So yeah, next question is for, I guess, all the speakers. What does it mean when saying that a peatland is restored? Is there evidence that this restoration reduces the incidence of fire? Because this evidence may help in actions to be taken moving forward.
I can maybe try. I think it's a difficult one to answer, because when I think the talk about the restoration of peatland forest is often about re-wetting, and I think sometimes we hear that as a kind of technical term. I mean, that really means what it sounds like it is basically you're pumping back water into these areas and ensuring that they kind of reabsorb it. But I think it's only one part of the equation. I mean, the restoration piece also requires tree planting, restoring it. But at the same time, there's also, the elephant in the room, which often is not addressed, is that open peat canals are often used as, what's the word, transportation links to communities in areas that don't have roads. And so you can't just say to a community that's been using an open peat canal as their main form of transportation to get in and out of the village that, sorry, we want to restore this, we're just going to block you, and sorry, too bad, you guys, you can't use this anymore. So there really needs to be like this element where you are working with the community there to sort of see how you can best restore it. And it's never going to be perfect, which is why, I think the discussion around peat restoration is often much more valuable when you're talking about restoring peat that has just been opened or peat that's just been started, drainage process, rather than the peat areas that have become canals and have been there for like, decades or 5 years. Those are areas where suddenly I think the conversation becomes a little bit more complicated, and you do have to consider the human element of the community use of that area. So, if we want to talk about restoration, if it is an area that is being used by the communities, you do need to also consider how the community can potentially make a livelihood out of that area. And, there have been trials by various organizations in Sumatra on things like introducing fish farming within the canals, or even, I think the polludiculture that PM Haze is starting to do with Sego. That's also, I think, another arena there. But I think it is a sort of, overall element there. Whether or not there is data to show that the full scale of restoration is reducing the number of fires, I think, frankly, it's a little bit too early to see whether or not that's going to have a kind of impact or trend. But I think that the key right now is focusing on making those efforts on restoration actually more longer lasting.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Pep on that. Thanks Bernard for the question. I think that Bernard, you might be more of an authority on this issue than me, but I'll attempt to talk about it a little bit more. I mean like what Pep said, right? I think restoration is something that is an evolving conversation, because there's still a lot that we don't know about tropical peatlands, because tropical peatlands are still very relatively young ecosystems, right? And the thing is that I'm sure you're aware that there has been various methods or things that have been tested on peatland areas that maybe have been cultivated on before, or they have not been cultivated on before. Different kinds of methods have been going on. So I believe that, from our perspective, definitely there needs to be a holistic approach, right? So you can't just do rewetting. You need to also do revegetation, and you need to ensure that this revegetation is maintained over a period of time, to ensure that there is some opportunity for the forest to naturally regenerate in that process, right? So and these things take time, right? And I guess peatland restoration really only came into focus perhaps after the 2015 fires, right? And people started looking into peatland restoration and putting money into research and things like that. So I think there still remains a lot to be done, and I'm quite optimistic in the sense that I think that there has been a lot more resources that's been put into this, whether it's coming from the governments, or whether it's coming from the private sector, or whether it's efforts coming from various non-profits on the ground. I think there has been a lot more efforts into peatland restoration over the years since 2015. But I think that would be interesting data to collect, right? I mean, in terms of like, do we even have data that shows how much land was actually restored in, say, from 2015 to 2019, for example, right? What is the annual rate of restoration, right? And how do we actually define restoration? So do we define restoration by simply we put a couple of canal blocks here and there, and then we say that, okay, the land is restored? Or do we need to say that you need to put in that process of revegetation, we need to put in the process of maybe even monitoring the land, maintaining the trees and all that, in order for it to actually be called restoration in that sense? So I think it will be. I mean, I'm not sure if this data has been collected. I suspect that probably not, but perhaps I think this will be an interesting area to definitely look into.
All right. Then next question is from Hannah for Pat. So what is Wilma doing to reduce the negative effects of fire risk in already converted land? And then also, do you think the large-scale conversion of forests to palm oil plantations make the landscape more prone to fire?
I think so. I kind of described this already in the response around the link between deforestation and fire risk, and in that it is, it's kind of in the same direction, but it doesn't always equate the same thing. But I think you do need to mitigate, I think, the perception that there's been like this massive development of palm oil deforestation in Indonesia in recent years. And in fact, if you look at the reports that Tropical Forest Alliance have released over the last 5 years since the New York Declaration was made in 2015, you will see that Indonesia has actually seen a drop in deforestation rates from then, and this is largely due to really, I think, the stalling or sort of no longer a push for full development of palm plantation. So I think the perception that deforestation is happening because or generated just by the demand for palm, I think is incorrect. And you can see that in the deforestation data trends also that WRI put up. But I think the real question there is really around, does it have an effect? And of course it does have an effect, right? So anything that changes, I think what is on the land will have an impact on whether that land becomes drier, whether it's more accessible by people, therefore the risk of fire becomes higher. So I think it is part of that overall risk, but the key thing here is I think we do have to stop finger pointing at just the agriculture and plantation companies if you want to really get down to the root of the problem, because as again, we consistently data that is put out there by NGOs, by WRI on the mapping platforms show that around 70% of fires are occurring outside of these areas. And so it is important also to put some focus on the effort of what's being done outside of agriculture areas, so within communities, village land, etc. So that's an important piece of it. Question around what are we doing with areas that have already been opened up. NDPE policies, peat doesn't, Wilmar's NDPE policy doesn't allow for new peat development in our suppliers. If there's evidence to show that new peat development has occurred, they will be removed from our supply chain, and we have done that. As of end 2016, we have removed about 1.5 million hectares of plantation areas from our supply chain from 26 companies at group level that have been non-compliant to our NDPE policy. So that, I think, is sort of the biggest deterrent, is that you may lose business from NDPE compliant company like Wilmar. But what we have there is sort of a requirement for where plantations are existing on peat, that you have to adhere to best management practices on peat agriculture that are defined by the RSPO. So there are elements of what we are trying to do, but I think the biggest piece here is, I think we still need to find a solution for how we work with that 70% that's occurring outside of the plantation agriculture areas.
Okay, thanks, Pep. So next question is for all the panelists, all the speakers. Recently, this is from Andrew. Recently, Indonesia has pledged to respect international law as Singapore investigates companies and individuals linked to the 2015 land and forest fires. What is your opinion regarding transboundary haze on this recent news? Ben, you want to answer?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a response. It's another very difficult question. This was asked by Andrew, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe Andrew, you can share, if you don't mind. Maybe you can share that article that you talked about how Indonesia is actually talking about respecting international law, and and all, and that the particular thing that you mentioned, it might be nice for us to just have a look at it. But yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely a positive, I guess. If we think about how are we going to manage the causes of transboundary haze from Singaporean perspective, in that sense. I mean, if I think that of course one of the few things that we have, that the Singapore government has been facing challenges with is investigations on the ground. For example, how do you have jurisdiction to actually go to Indonesia and gather evidence or gather information from local enforcement, or whether is it from the companies themselves that are operating in Indonesia. So I think that might be something that we will that will help us to perhaps overcome these challenges if the Indonesian government were a bit more welcoming in that sense. Yeah, and I think that in that respect, we may be able to go after these errant companies, for example, right? But I think that that's perhaps not the best. I'm not sure. I mean, to be very honest, this is my personal opinion. I'm not a big fan of the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, right? Because I feel that that there are a lot of even though it conforms to international law and is good and all that, right? But I think that there is a different understanding of what law is. For example, is a